Here's an expanded version of Chapter 1, written in the true crime documentary style you requested, about 600 words long, and without headings. In a quiet suburban town, the high school sat at the heart of the community. Parents took pride in sending their children there, believing it to be a place of discipline, safety, and opportunity. The teachers were more than just educators, they were trusted role models. Among them was Mims, Caroline Hayes, a woman who seemed to embody everything a parent could want in a teacher. She was 34 years old, intelligent, stylish, and approachable. Her students admired her for the way she made literature come alive, and parents respected her professionalism. Yet, behind her warm smile and polished appearance, Caroline carried a loneliness that would lead her down a dark and destructive path. Caroline's life outside the classroom was less perfect than it appeared. Recently divorced, she lived alone in a modest house, just a few streets away from the school. The end of her marriage had left her feeling vulnerable, craving attention and validation she no longer received at home. Her evenings, once filled with dinners and shared routines, were now empty and silent. At first, she filled the void with work, staying late at school and pouring herself into grading papers. But as the months passed, her craving for companionship grew stronger. That was when she began to blur the boundaries between teacher and student, slowly stepping into a dangerous territory she could not control. It started innocently enough. Long conversations after class with students who admired her, moments where she felt appreciated in ways she no longer experienced in her personal life. Caroline began exchanging text messages with a few students under the guise of offering academic help. Her phone buzzed late at night with questions about homework, and she answered them eagerly, thrilled to have someone reaching out to her. Before long, the conversations shifted from academics to personal matters. She found herself talking about her divorce, her loneliness, and her struggles. The students listened, and she felt a dangerous sense of comfort. The line she was crossing became thinner with every interaction, but she convinced herself it was harmless. In reality, she was already losing the ability to separate her professional responsibilities from her personal desires. The attention she received from her students gave her a sense of control, a feeling of being wanted. For someone who had recently felt discarded and invisible, it was intoxicating. Soon Caroline's late-night texts turned into secretive meetings, private tutoring sessions, stretched into hours of laughter and confessions that had nothing to do with schoolwork. Her trust in the secrecy of these encounters grew, and with it, her recklessness. Among the students, two young men stood out. Both were drawn to Caroline in ways that went beyond respect for a teacher. She entertained their attention, flattered by their interest and eager to keep their focus on her. What began as stolen glances and casual compliments quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. Caroline told herself she was still in control, that she could manage these hidden connections without consequences. But deep down, she knew she was entering a world built on lies and secrets. Around her, the town remained oblivious. Parents continued to greet her warmly at school functions, unaware of the deception forming behind closed doors. Colleagues admired her dedication, never suspecting that her late hours were spent entangled in relationships she should never have pursued. The students who knew whispered among themselves, creating an undercurrent of rumors that had yet to reach the surface. Caroline could sense the danger growing, but the thrill of secrecy and the comfort of attention kept pulling her deeper. In the quiet halls of the school and the stillness of her empty home, Caroline's double life was beginning to take shape. She had stepped into a world that promised excitement but demanded secrecy, a world where every choice carried a shadow of risk. What she could not yet see was how quickly this secret life would unravel, leading not just to scandal, but to a gruesome tragedy that would shock the entire community. Rumors have a way of spreading in high schools, often faster than anyone can control. For Caroline Hayes, the whispers began softly at first. A few students noticed how often she stayed behind after class with certain boys. Others pointed out the long glances exchanged in the hallway, or how she lingered at her desk long after the final bell, waiting for someone specific to stop by. At first, no one took the gossip seriously. She was a respected teacher, after all, someone above suspicion. But in the world of teenagers, secrets rarely remain hidden for long, and soon her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Caroline felt the tension before she even heard the rumors. There was a shift in the way some students looked at her, a knowing smile here, a stifled laugh there. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was paranoia, but the truth was that too many details were slipping through her control. She was texting late into the night, meeting in places she thought were discreet, and relying too much on the silence of those who already knew. Each risk carried with it the possibility of exposure, and her confidence began to mix with fear. Her situation grew more complicated because of Daniel and Ryan, the two students who had captured her attention. Daniel was confident, outgoing, and clever. He was a senior, months away from graduating, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the rules did not apply to him. Caroline felt both intimidated and enchanted by him, caught in the thrill of his boldness. Ryan, on the other hand, was different. He was quieter, more sensitive, and deeply attached to her in a way that unsettled her. While Daniel treated their connection like a game, Ryan clung to it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. At first, she thought she could balance both relationships, keeping them separate and managing their emotions. But jealousy has a way of eating through silence. Daniel knew about Ryan, though he dismissed him as unimportant, a boy competing for something far beyond his reach. Ryan, however, sensed that Caroline's attention was drifting, and the idea of being replaced made him reckless. He began showing up unannounced, sending frantic messages, and demanding time with her. The more Daniel pressed his influence, the more Ryan threatened to expose what was happening. Caroline's nerves grew fragile under the pressure. Every day in the classroom became an act of performance. She smiled at parents during conferences, all while wondering if their children had repeated what they had heard. She exchanged polite greetings with colleagues, silently terrified that someone might stumble across her text messages or see her in a place she should not be. The school, once a sanctuary, had become a stage where one mistake could collapse everything. Daniel used her fear to his advantage. He had discovered the power he held over her, and he wasn't afraid to exploit it. He began asking for things beyond their secret meetings, gifts, money, and promises she was in no position to keep. He hinted at a future together, feeding her fantasies while tightening his grip. Caroline found herself caught between desire and desperation, pulled deeper into his manipulation with every passing day. Ryan, on the other hand, became increasingly volatile. His text messages shifted from pleading to threatening, reminding her that he could end her career with a single confession. He wanted her full attention, and when he realized he wasn't getting it, he grew resentful. Caroline tried to calm him, but her reassurances rang hollow. She was already too entangled with Daniel, and Ryan knew it. The tension between the two boys was a storm waiting to break. They began to confront each other in subtle ways, small acts of hostility that Caroline noticed but tried to dismiss. A shove in the hallway, a harsh word muttered under breath, a lingering stare that carried more weight than any insult. Their rivalry became a dangerous game, one that placed Caroline in the center as both prize and victim. For Caroline, the walls were closing in. She told herself she could still regain control, that if she managed the secrecy carefully enough, she could keep her life from unraveling. But every decision only pulled her further into the web. She was living two lives, one of a respected teacher admired by her community, and another of a woman entangled in relationships that could destroy her if revealed. The weight of that double life began to press heavily on her. Nights were sleepless, filled with fear that her phone would buzz with a message she couldn't explain, or that someone would see her where she shouldn't be. Days were spent scanning the faces of students, searching for signs that someone knew too much. She felt as though she was walking across a frozen lake, each step a gamble against the cracks forming beneath her feet. What Caroline could not yet see was that the cracks had already spread too far. The jealousy of two young men, the whispers of curious classmates, and her own inability to step away were converging into something dangerous. The life she thought she could control was slipping away, and the secret world she had built was transforming into a trap. Soon, the consequences of her choices would force themselves into the open, and there would be no way to hide from what was coming. The breaking point arrived on a humid spring evening, when the tension between Ryan and Caroline finally erupted in the open. Ryan had been growing restless for weeks, his messages laced with anger and desperation. He felt abandoned, betrayed by the woman he had believed was devoted to him. Unable to accept her distance, he decided to confront her face to face. He waited outside her house until the street fell quiet, and when Caroline returned home, he emerged from the shadows. The argument that followed was loud enough for neighbors to notice, though most dismissed it as nothing more than a heated dispute between adults. No one realized the confrontation marked the beginning of a deadly unraveling. Caroline's fear deepened that night. Ryan had threatened to tell the school principal everything, insisting he had proof of their relationship. The risk was no longer abstract. Exposure now felt imminent. Her mind raced with images of her career collapsing, her name plastered across headlines, and the judgment of an entire community that once admired her. She tried to convince herself that Ryan was only bluffing, but the intensity in his eyes told her otherwise. The threats weren't empty. He was willing to destroy her if she didn't give him what he wanted. The next day, she confided in Daniel, hoping for reassurance. But Daniel's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of calming her fears, he used the situation to tighten his grip. He told her Ryan was dangerous and unpredictable, a ticking bomb that needed to be silenced. At first, Caroline rejected the idea, horrified by the implication. But Daniel pressed further, painting vivid pictures of what would happen if Ryan exposed them both. Caroline's career would be over, Daniel's future would be ruined, and the scandal would drag them all down together. He suggested that there was only one way to make sure Ryan never spoke again. Caroline felt sick at the thought, but Daniel's words echoed in her mind long after their conversation ended. Every glance from a colleague seemed filled with suspicion. Every text alert made her heart race, fearing it was Ryan following through on his threat. She was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The more she considered Daniel's suggestion, the less outrageous it began to sound. She told herself she wasn't planning anything, that she was only imagining possibilities, but in truth, the idea had already taken root. Her breaking point came a week later, when Ryan sent her a series of messages late at night. He said he was done waiting, and would tell the principal everything the next morning. Panic consumed her, the image of police at her door, of losing her job, of sitting in a courtroom surrounded by accusations. All of it collided in her mind until she could no longer think rationally. In that moment of desperation, she decided the threat had to be eliminated. Caroline reached out to Ryan, pretending she wanted to resolve their differences. She told him to meet her at a secluded park on the edge of town, a place she knew would be empty after dark. Ryan agreed, thinking he had finally forced her into choosing him. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. When the night came, the park was silent except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. The faint glow of streetlights barely touched the tree line, leaving the path in near darkness. Ryan arrived first, pacing nervously as he waited. When Caroline finally appeared, her face was pale, her expression unreadable. What unfolded next was quick, chaotic and brutal. In a frenzy of fear and rage, Ryan was struck down with a blunt object. The blows came fast, leaving him crumpled in the dirt, his cries fading into silence. Caroline's hands trembled as she realized what she had done. By the time she left the park, Ryan was gone, his body left in a shallow ditch just beyond the path. The silence of the night swallowed the violence, but the evidence remained. Caroline drove home in shock, her mind numb, convincing herself that she had done what was necessary. She told herself no one would find out, that the park was deserted, and the secret would remain buried. But secrets rarely stay hidden forever. The murder, that was meant to protect her life, had only set in motion a chain of events that would destroy it completely. When Ryan failed to return home the night of his confrontation with Caroline, his disappearance was noticed almost immediately. His parents grew concerned by morning, calling his phone again and again only to find it switched off. By the following afternoon, they contacted the police, reporting him missing. At first, investigators assumed it might be a case of a runaway teenager, a common occurrence in the town. But as hours turned into days, worry mounted. Flyers with Ryan's picture were posted around the community, and classmates whispered about his sudden absence. The unease spread quickly, gripping the town with a sense of dread. 3 days after his disappearance, a jogger in the wooded area near the park stumbled upon something horrifying. A body, partially hidden in a shallow ditch, lay covered by leaves and dirt. The scene was grisly, the result of blunt force trauma that had left Ryan barely recognizable. The discovery shook the community to its core. What had begun as a missing person case was now a homicide investigation, and the small town's sense of safety was shattered. Detectives immediately began piecing together Ryan's final days. They spoke with his friends, who reluctantly admitted he had been acting strangely, often upset and fixated on a teacher. Some hinted at late-night texts, while others claimed they had seen him arguing outside Caroline Hayes's home. The name caught investigators' attention, though at first they struggled to reconcile the respected teacher with the notion of being involved in something so sinister. Caroline, meanwhile, did everything she could to appear calm and collected. At school, she wore the mask of grief, expressing shock and sadness over Ryan's death. She comforted students in class, pretending to mourn alongside them. But beneath her carefully rehearsed expressions, she was unraveling. The memory of that night haunted her, and every knock at her door made her heart pound. The fear of discovery was relentless, and the guilt pressed heavier with each passing day. The investigation tightened around her when detectives obtained Ryan's phone records. The late-night messages revealed a pattern. Dozens of conversations with Caroline, many of them personal, far beyond the boundaries of a teacher and student relationship. Investigators also noted the sharp increase in heated exchanges in the weeks leading up to his death. Caroline was brought in for questioning, and though she managed to maintain her composure, her answers left gaps. She claimed the messages were related to mentoring, insisting Ryan had been struggling emotionally. Detectives weren't fully convinced, but they lacked enough evidence to make an arrest. Meanwhile, Daniel was falling apart. The reality of the murder gnawed at him, and the thrill he once felt had been replaced with terror. He worried constantly about being implicated, and feared Caroline would betray him to save herself. His anxiety spilled into conversations with a close friend, who began to piece together the truth. The friend, alarmed by what he heard, eventually shared the information with authorities. Though vague, the statements fueled the suspicions already surrounding Caroline. Detectives decided to dig deeper. A search warrant was issued for her home and car. What they found left little doubt. In the trunk of her vehicle, faint traces of blood were discovered. Forensic testing later confirmed it matched Ryan. In her garage, tucked behind boxes of old belongings, investigators uncovered a tire iron with residue consistent with the injuries Ryan had suffered. The evidence tied her directly to the crime scene. The facade Caroline had built was collapsing. Her attempts to control the narrative, her calm demeanor, her insistence on innocence, could no longer hold against the mounting proof. Though she had convinced herself the murder would remain buried in the shadows, it had instead dragged her life into the brightest, harshest spotlight imaginable. As investigators closed in, the whispers among students became louder. Everyone now had an opinion, a story, or a suspicion about what Caroline had been hiding all along. The truth, once buried in secrecy and denial, was about to come crashing into the open, exposing not just an affair, but a crime that would haunt the community for years. The case against Caroline Hayes moved swiftly once the forensic evidence came to light. Investigators had built a timeline that placed her with Ryan on the night of his death, and the blood in her car provided a connection that was nearly impossible to dismiss. Within days, she was taken into custody, her arrest sending shockwaves through the small community. Parents who once praised her teaching now looked on with disbelief, struggling to reconcile the image of a trusted educator with the woman accused of murdering a student. The school district immediately suspended her, and the town that had once embraced her now recoiled in disgust. The trial became a spectacle, drawing media outlets from across the state. Every detail of Caroline's private life was dissected in the courtroom. Her text messages with Ryan were read aloud, exposing the inappropriate relationship she had fought so hard to conceal. Photographs, call logs, and personal notes were entered into evidence, each piece painting a damning picture of obsession, manipulation, and desperation. The story of a teacher entangled in forbidden affairs and driven to violence was too scandalous to ignore. But the most damaging blow came from Daniel. Faced with his own role in the scandal, he chose to testify in exchange for leniency. On the stand, he described Caroline's growing panic after Ryan's threats, and recounted their conversations about silencing him. His testimony revealed not only her fear of exposure, but also her willingness to consider a deadly solution. While Daniel framed himself as a frightened teenager caught in something beyond his control, Caroline was portrayed as the manipulative adult who had orchestrated the crime. His words carried weight, and the jury listened closely. Caroline's defense attempted to argue that Ryan's death was not premeditated, suggesting instead that it had been a tragic accident born out of a heated confrontation. They emphasized her emotional instability, her recent divorce, and the pressure she felt from the escalating situation. But the brutality of Ryan's injuries and the discovery of the weapon in her garage undermined those claims. The prosecution painted her as someone who had carefully planned the meeting in the park, luring Ryan there with the intention of silencing him permanently. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the proceedings. Former students sat in the gallery, some shocked, others grimly nodding as rumors they once whispered about were confirmed. Parents sat with folded arms, glaring at the woman they believed had betrayed their trust. Caroline herself appeared composed at times, but moments of visible anxiety betrayed her. When the jury was sent to deliberate, the weight of months of secrecy and lies bore down on her, and for the first time, she seemed to realize there was no escape. The verdict came quickly, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom as Caroline stood frozen, her career, reputation, and freedom stripped away in a single moment. She was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The once respected teacher who had been celebrated for her talent and warmth would now spend decades behind bars, remembered not for her accomplishments, but for the scandal and violence that ended a young man's life. The aftermath left scars on the community that would not heal easily. The school struggled to rebuild its reputation, students and parents alike haunted by the betrayal of someone they had trusted. Ryan's family, devastated by the loss, withdrew from public life, their grief overshadowed by the sensationalism of the trial. Daniel carried his own burden, spared prison but forever tied to a story that would follow him long after graduation. In the end, Caroline's story became a cautionary tale repeated in hushed tones, a reminder of how quickly boundaries can blur, how secrecy and obsession can destroy lives, and how choices made in desperation can lead to irreversible tragedy. What began as a hidden affair meant to satisfy loneliness ended in a brutal murder that shocked an entire town and left behind a legacy of pain.